Hi, this is Deb Wenger. Today we're going to talk about the business of media, from consolidation to the idea that the media industry is global in nature, to a concept called the long tail, which will be really valuable for you to understand as we look at how the mass communication business operates in a digital world. So the business of media is something that doesn't get a lot of discussion in journalism schools. And I believe, and several of my colleagues in the Meek School believe, that journalists will do a better job if they better understand the business side of the job that they do and the companies that they work for. So this will be an important chapter for you as journalists to take quite seriously, as well as anybody thinking about going into marketing, PR, advertising, and any other field that is involved with communications. So there have been many changes in big media over the past few years. As we made the point in the previous chapter, it really is not accurate to say that there are 6 or 7 or 5 major conglomerates that run American media. And why is that? That's because new media companies like Apple, Google, Facebook are becoming increasingly important and increasingly powerful in the new media and in the media space in general. And we're going to talk about each of those individually in just a few minutes. The other thing that's happening more routinely in the big media world is that companies grow larger, then they divest themselves of certain properties. So it's really hard to keep track, actually, as someone like myself who studies the media. It can be difficult to remember who owns what because so many companies are bought and sold and ownership changes take place all the time in the media. So why is it even important to understand the concept of big media then if all these changes are taking place? Well, there still is a tremendous power in the ability of a company to implement what's called vertical integration. So as you can see here, vertical integration means controlling all aspects of a media project, including the production, delivery to consumers in multiple formats, and the promotion of the product through other media. So let's take Disney, for example. Definitely considered one of the big media companies. So when they produce a new program for the Disney Channel cable channel, they control the production of that TV show. They control the delivery of the product to consumers in multiple formats. So you can watch it streaming on DisneyChannel.com. You can watch it via Netflix. You can watch it on traditional cable. And then the promotion of that product. So if the show happens to have someone who sings, you can bet that music from the show is going to be on Radio Disney, or interviews with the stars of the show will be on Radio Disney. You might see a show at a Disney theme park that's based off of what's happening on that Disney Channel program. So this idea of vertical integration, being able to leverage all the different aspects of a message from production to dissemination, that whole chain is controlled by one company. Part and parcel of that is the idea of synergy. So a large company like Disney can use the strength of its various divisions to market its content. So when Pixar produces a new movie, it might turn into a ride at a Disney theme park. It may spin off into a cartoon show that's going to be aired on Disney Channel. So the possibilities are endless, not to mention the merchandising of the products, etc., etc. So what are some examples of big media companies, sometimes called legacy media companies? Well, we've already talked about Disney. In previous lectures, we've talked about News Corp, which owns not only Fox News, but also the Wall Street Journal and Dow Jones News Service. Time Warner, Viacom, CBS, and Bertelsmann. So we're going to take a little closer look at 3 of these companies that offer slightly different views on what we mean by big media companies. So let's start with Disney. In 2010, sales of $38.1 billion. That could buy and sell some small countries. Of course, Disney is a major player in broadcast TV. They own many television stations around the country. Big player in cable, radio, movies. Home of Pixar and Lucasfilm. And a real pioneer of this idea of synergy, of the ability of one division to promote what's happening in another division. And we talked about that. Another big company, Time Warner. So Time Warner, a mere $26.9 billion in sales in 2010. And that was after some big losses in 2008. So your text talks about companies getting too big. This might be an example of a company that went too far in trying to own various products and create those synergies and vertical integration. So they actually improved their profitability by selling off AOL and Time Warner Cable. So they bounced back from those losses in 2008 by becoming a little bit smaller. They too are a major player in film, television, cable, publishing, online content. I mentioned Bleacher Report, which is owned by Turner, which is owned by Time Warner. So sometimes it can be really hard to even figure out what these companies own because they own big companies that used to be standalone companies like Turner. They absorb them but keep their name. However, they're owned by a big parent conglomerate corporation. Home of Scooby-Doo, Harry Potter, Batman. If you ever watch Cartoon Network, you're watching a product that is owned by Time Warner. They are the proof of the point that bigger isn't always better. They actually were more profitable by spinning off some of the companies that were dragging down their profits and making it harder for them to generate revenue. Bertelsmann. So this is a unique player, maybe a name that you have not heard before. A mere $22 billion in 2009. A major player in publishing. They own Random House, for example, magazines, and European broadcasting. Home of American Idol and the Idol programs globally. So they got a major hit and then franchised that idea throughout the global society that we live in. This is a privately held German company. So that means no stockholders here. That $22 billion is owned by a small group of individuals. That's pretty staggering when you think about that much money in the hands of just a few individuals. But all of this is changing. The whole idea of who constitutes big media players now, I think, really has to include companies like Google, Apple, Facebook, and yes, even Amazon.com. I think there has been quite a bit written, and you may find some good examples of writing on this subject of how Amazon is actually becoming a media business. We'll talk a little bit more about that later in the lecture, but you know, they're in the advertising game. They are in the streaming video game. They're not just an online marketplace for shopping. So Google, 2010 revenue of more than $29 billion. That puts it somewhere between News Corp and Time Warner in sales. The big service that Google provides is search. It's a major source of targeted online advertising, so that's where the company makes most of its money. It's also an automated aggregator of news, and it somewhat remains to be seen whether Google is a real friend of the news industry or actually a major enemy. There was a time when many publishers credited Google for major losses in revenue for newspaper publications as dollars moved from traditional print publications to online publications, it was Google that was snatching up the greatest share of those digital dollars. Now, as newspaper publishers and other publishers get more sophisticated in how they go after digital dollars, Google and its search capabilities may actually end up being of benefit, driving traffic that wouldn't otherwise find the content that the news organization is developing. But again, it sort of remains to be seen. When we look back, I think we'll have a better view of whether or not Google was a benefit or a detriment to the news industry. Apple. Well, this $65 billion that the company owned in 2010 is double or more of the other companies that we've been talking about. Of course, most of that revenue came from hardware sales, iPhones, iPods, iPads. But Apple is a major player in the music and video sales industry. And perhaps more importantly, Apple has really redefined how we consume and use media. And if you think about this concept that, the medium is the message, then Apple, by changing the medium which we use to communicate and to consume messages, has had a tremendous impact on media. So this concept of long tail versus short head is really fascinating. And I'm hoping that by showing you the graphic first, I can help walk you through this concept. So you see here in orange is the short head component of this. So let me give you an example. If I am a movie studio and I produce the movie Titanic, and literally hundreds of thousands of people go to view my movie, that one movie has a tremendous impact on my revenue generation, right? So that one movie brings in millions and millions of dollars. Same movie studio might produce 20 more okay movies that don't get hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people watching the movies, but those 20 movies might generate as an aggregate the same amount of audience. So that green portion of the graphic, the long tail, those 20 smaller movies might generate as much aggregate audience as that one blockbuster movie. So if you apply the long tail concept to media, what you're talking about is it's the point in the distribution curve where a limited number of people are interested in buying a lot of different products. So you don't have the mass numbers coming to get one particular product. You have smaller numbers coming to get many different products. So the short head is the portion of the distribution curve where a large number of people are interested in a limited number of products. So it's important to understand the media business to be able to answer the question, who controls the media? So let's take the idea that the owners of media control what is published, what is disseminated, what is created. And to some extent, I think that question could be answered with both a yes and a no. So take Bertelsmann, for example, which owns Random House. So if Random House decides to publish your book, you probably have a better shot at it becoming widely read than if you self-publish. However, that doesn't mean that some books that are published by big media don't flop, and it doesn't mean that some self-published books don't take off and become cultural phenomena. So do advertisers control the media? Well, again, it's a yes and a no. So if I'm a company that's producing television programming, and television is still by and large an ad-supported medium, I don't want to produce programs that advertisers won't want to have their content associated with. So I may avoid certain topics in order to ensure that my content is advertiser friendly. Now, does that mean that there are independent producers who won't go out there and tackle very controversial subjects and get them, those programs aired and shared? No, absolutely not. That does happen. But advertisers do have a measure of control over the media. What about special interest groups? Well, let's take the example of the organizations that have pushed for movie ratings, for example. A few years ago, NC-17 sort of replaced what would have been called an X-rated movie. Well, the whole idea was that that would give parents information about movies that had content that was totally unacceptable for any child under 17. The impact of that rating system has been that producers will do almost anything to avoid getting an NC-17 rating. So they will take scenes out of movies in order to get an R instead of an NC-17. So special interest groups have had some influence and have some control over what gets produced in the movie industry, for example. Government. Well, we're going to talk a lot more about this when we get to the broadcast chapter. The government exerts a great deal of control over the broadcast industry, but in other areas as well. News sources absolutely have some measure of control. Can news sources keep content out of broadcasts or out of publications? They certainly sometimes try and sometimes are successful, but oftentimes are not. So news sources can control the media by refusing to comment, or can control the media by leaking documents that wouldn't otherwise be published. So influence, control are part and parcel of all of these entities. But probably the biggest change in recent years has been the control that the audience exerts. So never before has the audience had so much power. Have you had so much power? Have I had so much power? So the audience has the power to decide what gets produced and what doesn't, because if we're not going to consume it, companies don't want to produce it. The audience has control over how content is delivered. One of the things that you see when you read the newspaper chapter, for example, is as people prefer to consume content more often in a digital format than in a printed format, they will influence how content gets disseminated. So audience has a huge amount of power. So who controls the media? All of these entities. So just a reminder that I am looking for tweets here. I would love it if you would follow me on Twitter. That would allow me to direct message you if I have a question about something you've tweeted, or I'm not 100% sure who you are by your Twitter name, and that will allow me to be able to track people who are sharing relevant content. So this should be directly related to what we're talking about in our lectures or in our discussions online. And I'd love to have you tweet often and well for fabulous prizes. Okay, so what I mean by fabulous prizes is points on the final exam, but sometimes that can be fabulous. And please use the hashtag UMJOUR101. So be sure to check out Blackboard for assignments related to this lecture, and keep up with the lectures, the reading, the quizzes, etc. The more that you do, the more consistently you do it, the better you'll do in this class.